Good morning, everyone. My name is Josh Jacobs, Senior Vice President, Artilist, and with me is my colleague, Rich. Rich, introduce yourself.
Welcome, everybody, to the webinar we're holding today on CMMC timeline demystifying. Thank you for joining. I am the solutions architect for Artilist. Looking forward to discussing the CMMC and pathways to get you certified.
So the topic today, deciphering CMMC 2.0 timelines and milestones. I think we're going to kick off with a quick overview of what CMC is. CMMC, or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, comprehensive cybersecurity standard developed by the DoD specifically for businesses involved in government contracts, right? So the entire defense industrial base, specifically handling controlled unclassified information. The aim is to safeguard controlled unclassified information from cyber threats, ensuring a higher level of security across the entire defense supply chain. What is CUI, or controlled unclassified information? CUI refers to sensitive information that requires protection but is not classified under national security regulations. CUI can include technical drawings, research data, personal information of military personnel. The loss or compromise of CUI can have serious consequences for national security, making its protection a top priority for DoD. In the last few months, I think one of the things we've discovered in conversation with a lot of customers and a lot of defense industrial base organizations in general, the conversation around what is CUI and how do you categorize CUI has been a very key or very top of mind conversation, right? CUI basic and CUI specified have been the focal point of those conversations, and determining what CUI specified has been the number one priority for a lot of folks. While we typically have only come across a few specific categories, I wanted to take an opportunity to call out that there are a lot of category markings, probably enough that it would take up the entire hour time block of this webinar. But I wanted to call out a few organizational index groupings that own those markings: law enforcement, legal intelligence, critical infrastructure, natural and cultural resources, immigration, the financial industry, critical infrastructure, Privacy Act, Department of Defense, export control, international trafficking in arms, nuclear propulsion, naval nuclear propulsion information, the nuclear industry as a whole, procurement and acquisitions, and proprietary business and information. Those are, again, organizational index groupings. There's associated banner markings and banner marking authorities that coincide with each of those groups. And then a brief history of CUI. So back in 2004, the 9/11 Commission report recommendation for horizontal sharing of intelligence information across agencies. And then in 2010, Executive Order 13556 established a comprehensive CUI program in November of 2010. And as you can see on the screen, 2010 was a busy year, right? The designation of National Archives and Records Administration became the executive agent to implement and oversee CUI, as well as the collaborative discussion and consultation between executive agent and affected agencies to develop and implement a CUI program. 2015 saw the creation of the CUI registry. The CUI registry lists the categories and subcategories of information that require safeguarding and dissemination controls. And then in 2016, the issuance of 32 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 2002, an established policy for agencies on designation, handling, and decontrolling information they identify as CUI.
Yes, to pick up where you left off, Josh, you identified the Title 32 CFR, as mentioned, essentially started this. It establishes the CMMC program requirements. So in those requirements, you will have to complete or meet the NIST SP 800-171 security requirements. Along with that, they've introduced essentially the ability to have a POAM, and a POAM is an acronym for the Plan of Action and Milestones. So what that means essentially is this: you plan to take specific actions, and then the milestone essentially is the timeline. So what are you going to do, and what time is it going to be done? So you have a list of items that you need to complete. You can essentially meet them, not meet them, or they could be not applicable to your scenario or situation. In this scenario, you have one of three to choose. The POAM gives you the opportunity to be able to not meet it today, but identify what's missing and the time you're going to complete it, and then be able to at time or a time before that. So the POAM is a key feature here, allowing you to meet the certification and continue the line of business. But there's some rules around it. Namely, starting with CMMC in 2.0, you have level 1, level 2, and level 3. In the level 1 program, essentially, you don't have the availability of a POAM, which means you must meet all security requirements. No POAM necessary, or rather not necessary, excuse me, no POAM optional in the level 1 program. For the level 2 and 3, the POAM is something that is possible. You don't want to essentially start with a POAM, or you don't want to dive into this, activities thinking that I'll just use the POAM, because there are specific items that are in the 110 controls that are needed for level 2 that can be POAMable, if that's a word. The POAMable security requirements, we have listed a couple here on the screen, as you can see. They're specific ones. The point values that are associated with these particular security requirements, there's 1, 3, and 5 point available to be able to be selected for each security requirement. In the level 1, no POAM. Level 2 POAMs. The point value of 1 is a point value that is allowed to be on the POAM, meaning if you do not meet a 3 or a 5, you cannot pass the assessment. The level 1s essentially are, but in the POAM scenario, you have the ability to meet all of or most of, but there's some level 1 POAMs, or excuse me, level 1 security requirements that cannot be on a POAM. The first one here is the SCL2 3.1311, which is related to FIPS validation, right? That encryption needs to be employed. If you do not have that one, you cannot pass, nor can you put it on the POAM. So that makes sense. That one you may not know about, but there are some obvious ones, as you can see down below: external connections, public information, and escort visitors. To make sense of it, to not have a policy or not have security control to escort visitors into your place of business would not be reasonable, essentially. To say I can do that in 6 months, or I can do that in 5 months, put some controls around that, that would not be passable. So to give you some idea, that essentially is how they're introducing the POAMs, and the ways in which you can achieve them needs to be done in a specified time. In the new rule, with a level 2 or level 3, you have 180 days to meet this. If I say I'm going to be done by this time, it cannot extend past 180 days. So I know I went in depth on that one. We'll move over to essentially the flow down. The flow down requirements as I identified, you needed an assessment. They are primarily the responsibility of prime contractors for the CMMC requirement. The prime contractor essentially will pass that down to its subcontractors, which means the subcontractor must meet the equivalent requirement of the prime contractor. And that is a key determinator there. If they are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, and they have it in their contracts, that flow down requirement will follow down to the subcontractor. So as you can see, there's a lot of activities that are associated with the CMMC proposed rule. That there is some cost. In the proposed rule, essentially, they've outlined the specific costs for conducting the assessment. It starts off with the periodicity, understanding what level that you have. You have a level 1, it's an annual assessment. Level 2, a triennial assessment, and level 3, so forth. And then moving forward down, you can see essentially the plan and prepare the assessment. With this assessment, you're essentially looking to assess things that have already been in place. Josh identified the CFR 32 or 32 CFR essentially was put in place over 6 years, which means you should be doing these things every since that time or ever since you began your contract. So identifying it as a new cost for you should not be there. You should have been doing these things in place. It should not cost you exactly this much. But if you're starting today and you're having to move along on program, move along on getting assessments done, this essentially is where you would look for giving you some guidance on what the cost will be. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a question on POAMs.
So it looks like the question is for level 2, if you don't have FIPS validated encryption, FIPS 140-2 validated encryption implemented, can you put it on the POAM?
So you can put on the POAM that you have encryption validation enabled. You can get that on the POAM. Essentially, this is a sort of a weird one. You have to have encryption in place, and then you can essentially put it on the POAM for if you have encryption. The way it reads is if you have encryption, you'll get a 3. If you have encryption, you get a 3. If you have FIPS, you get a 5. So the way that they've worded that, it's somewhat confusing. But to say if you do not have FIPS validated encryption enabled, then you should not pass this assessment.
I think the question, though, Rich, is if you have encryption, but you don't have FIPS validated encryption, you would put it on your POAM that you intend to have FIPS validated encryption by that 180-day mark. Can you do that?
According to the proposed rule, yes, you can put it in that way.
Great.
Thank you for clarifying that, Josh. Appreciate that. All right. Moving on to the assessment and the appeals. As you know, you're going to be assessed by a party organization. That third-party organization essentially will come in, evaluate your environment, and they may have a perception that's different from another third-party assessor. They're going to be assessing you on the same guidelines, but they may see it or they may miss something, let's say, for example, and then your pathway essentially doesn't stop there. The contractors do have the ability to appeal the C3PO assessment that's there for that to handle. They will initially handle disputes internally at the C3PO, and then it gets to be an escalation situation where the accreditation body would have the final decision on whether or not you that assessment objective. And then looking at some additional guidelines, around CSPs and ESPs. CSPs, they are essentially cloud service providers, and ESPs are external service providers. Uh, as it stands today, you must meet essentially, or rather comply with the FedRAMP moderate standards or equivalent if you're one of these providers. Um, ESPs would be, those that you're outsourcing IT or cyber services where they must also meet the CMMC level that they contract, that they support for. So this is a very key delineation there to identify if you're a cloud service provider, you have some FedRAMP moderate standards that you need to meet. If you're an external service provider, you have some CMMC level standards that you need to meet. So when you're selecting your service providers or you're looking to identify or outsource some form of IT or functions, you need to make sure and ensure that their security requirements are met, whether it's on the FedRAMP level or essentially on the CMMC level. Which brings us to what we started here to work with. We're going to spend a lot of time in this area because this is very, very important. As we start to identify the timeline in which the CMMC rollout happens, what we're looking at here essentially is essentially a four-phase approach within 3 years. It starts off in the 0 to 6 month phase, essentially, where we integrate or bring in the level 1 and level 2 self-assessments. These essentially will be mandatory conditions, but this happens in the 0 to 6 month phase. That's when the CMM rule regulation becomes final and published and is able to be put inside of contracts. In the first 6 months, level 1 and level 2 self-assessments would become mandatory conditions for all of the relevant DoD contracts and solicitations that you see. The DoD does have the option, or they have the ability to opt in for a level 2 certification instead of a self-assessment. Essentially, they may do that in select cases. It seems to be an outlier and not necessarily the standard or the thing likely to happen, essentially. But what will definitely happen is the level 1, level 2 self-assessment during the 0 to 6 month phase. In the second phase, that's in the 7 to 12 month period. You're looking at a point in time when level 2 certifications will become the standard condition in relevant contracts and solicitations. So what does that mean, essentially? That means is that will be in your contract, right? Right now, today, what governs the rules of engagement for your contract? Today, you may see the 70-12 clause inside that contract. There are rules of engagement for that you need to adhere to, which are the NIST 800-171 requirements that you need to meet. So all along, you should be doing this if you have that in your contract. And then what we're doing in 7 to 12, there's a little bit more of an advancement where the certification assessment may become more of a likelihood that you will run up against, and it will fall within your contracts. So the DoD does retain the option to introduce these certifications during the option periods. What that means for you essentially is you may get an award next month, and in that award, it says you need to meet DFAR 70-12 clause, at which point you take the steps to do so. You have a POAM in place, and it doesn't have the 180 days assigned to it. It has days that the next calendar year coming up, the DoD will have the option to keep the contract as it is or introduce the level 2 assessment, certification at that point in time, and which means that time is of the essence for most of us who are supporting the federal government. If you're on a self-assessment today, it could turn into a level 2 not self-assessment, but a level 2 certification from a C3PO at the next renewal cycle, which could be within 12 months from now. And we'll get into that in a later slide where we're looking at implementation will take approximately 12 to 18 months to complete. So time is of the essence. That timeline is moving. CMMC and DoD is not falling behind. It looks on this schedule, they're moving quite aggressively and moving in alignment. Also, during the 7 to 12 month period, we're going to be introducing the level 3 certification assessments. This is a condition essentially that may show up. It's not likely. The individuals who have, or companies rather, who have a level 3 certification assessment that gets introduced, one thing that needs to be understood is you must achieve a level 2 certification before you can essentially go for your level. Very important that happens there, and you understand level 2 comes first, and then you can essentially go for your level 3. Again, 7 to 12 months after this happens, that's not enough time if you haven't started yet. So we can move to that. Talk a little bit more of that and get in the next slide. The contractors who completed the self-assessment in the initial phase, they may be required to get the certification assessment. And that is not for solely the self-assessments, that's for both, because annually you will have to essentially self-attest. And so looking at the next phase, the third phase, this here is where level 2 certification assessments will become mandatory for all applicable contracts. The DoD may include level 3 certification assessments in all of the application contracts and solicitations. This is now pushing it a little forward. This is essentially the last step before everything goes final, and all contracts will have the requirements related to the level of use that's needed, whether it's a 1, level 2, or level 3. So in the third phase, the level 2 level 2 certification and level 3 certs will likely be in play. That will go for about 12 months, a calendar year. These are all estimated times. And then in the final phase, the DoD is likely to implement all contracts that are going to be awarded, essentially would require each candidate to have in place before they could start work, essentially, or before they are awarded this, is to have the required certification assessed and completed by the time of award. So 4 phases, about 3 years, 2027 is that time frame we're looking at. So it's coming up, it's coming around the corner. We're going to dive into the next slide with the timeline and activities that are happening during that period. So what we've chosen here to show you is a diagram that was first introduced to us by the Cyber AB in last year in 2023. We showed you this here in this format so that you could see and understand that it doesn't look like it's going to be pushed right. What they've stated in this time, it's still holding true today. From everything that we hear, see, and activities that are happening, is exactly the way DoD has laid it out, exactly the way the Cyber AB has continued to how this is going to play out. It started off with the draft of the publication, and then essentially the rule being submitted, published. That 3-month public comment period ended in February 26th of last month. We are now in March, early March here, mid-March more so. We're looking at approximately 12 to 18 months, as I stated, for what it will take for you to implement the NIST 800-171 security controls. This here is a pretty crucial identifier here to take a look at. As we scroll down below, there were 2 options that came up for the proposed rule. There was the proposed rule as which it was chosen, or the interim final rule. Because it was chosen or selected to be a proposed rule, there's been historically some timelines that we're using to give you a good predictor rather, of when the final publication will happen. This final publication is projected to happen right around December time period, which turns out to be the first quarter of 2025. Again, all aligning to what has been announced upwards of 7 years ago, where they stated that they wanted CMMC to be in place in fiscal year of 2025. Again, all lining up, all showing to be moving in accordance with the plan of DoD. And so since that's the case there, you can see that there's only 12 to 18 months, and it takes somewhere between 12 and 18 months for the average company to do the implementation for CMMC, which gives you the ability to essentially be ready by, if you started today, you're looking at an August timeframe on the far end, and maybe more like February, March of next year on the shorter end of that 12 to 18 months. So it says that, again, we need to move quickly and efficiently. We can talk a little bit more about that in later slides. Well, what steps and things you need to do to help you get to the place and space where you can compete and be able to meet the requirements. One other item that I wanted to introduce, or not introduce, but talk about essentially is the NIST 800-171 Rev 3. In the CMMC the proposed rule, they hard-coded or mentioned specifically the NIST SP 800-171 Rev 2. During that time, there was sorry about that. During that time, there was talks and discussions about what was essentially going to be the standard that CMMC was going to follow. Because of the rulemaking process, as you can see, it takes 12 to 15 months to complete the rulemaking process. And it's been hard-coded essentially in the current rule, which means that this here looks like it's going to be a non-factor for the next couple of years. The Rev 3 essentially won't be what the guidelines are going to be based on. It's going to be based on a Rev 2 because it has been hard-coded and it's in the public. The other piece here, looking at the timeline, is the C3PO assessments. This is what they projected essentially that they would have in the contracts and available and ready for execution, essentially, which is the party assessments. So along this way, you have self-assessments in this time period. And then here you're saying party assessment. Again, in 2025, as predicted or as projected, the DoD has stayed in line with the timeline, which means that you got to start looking at your risk mitigation strategies or your risk management strategies, essentially, understanding how you're going to take the next step. What process are you going to use? Are you going to internally, externally? What ways are you going to use this timeline to give you some guidance on steps to take and moving forward? What we'll do now is Josh will step into a little bit more of the next, essentially how you can use those risk management strategies to help you make decisions.
Thanks, Rich. So risk management strategies there, and I think we're all fairly familiar with identifying risk and understanding that we have to employ some type of risk mitigation and risk management to what we're doing in the cyber community. Step one, you'll see acknowledge gaps in readiness. And I think that gets after one particular methodology. Traditionally, that means I have a team of people in my organization, or I'm hiring an external organization to come in and conduct a gap analysis, to do a thorough deep dive in my environment, identify any particular risks or deficiencies in how I employ my cybersecurity program, document all of those gaps, document all of those potential risks, and then come up with an implementation or a mitigation plan to get to my overall desired state of readiness. And that is absolutely one tried and true method of doing it. One of the other methodologies that we've seen, which actually tends to be a bit more cost effective, and can move a little bit faster, is acknowledging that a gap analysis can be done, and assuming that the result is almost always the same, that, hey, we have a lot of gaps and we have to come up with a plan and we have to do a lot of mitigations or remediations. Why don't we move into a net new network or net new cloud environment and build it from scratch to mitigate everything before I have to identify what the potential gaps and risks are, right? So there's two different strategies to approach the beginning of your risk management strategy. Step 2, adopt or implement a phased remediation plan. I think 2 definitely goes hand in hand with strategy 1, right? Conducting a gap analysis and coming up with a plan. So here in step 2, you're adopting that plan and then you're implementing that plan in a phased approach. And a lot of that includes building out a POAM, a plan of action and milestones. Okay, so we know that we have this gap here in our incident response plan. Well, we need to develop a better incident response plan, and we need to conduct incident response tabletop activities, and we need to identify the right escalation paths and the right SOC personnel to conduct those incident response and remediation activities. Whereas if you followed the other strategy of net new, you are implementing a plan, but you're implementing it from scratch. You're still conducting a lot of those exercises, like the incident response tabletop exercise, but you don't have to implement a remediation plan. You're implementing your plan from scratch. So again, 2 different methodologies. One is a little bit more cost effective and a little bit faster. The other is, I know my network and I know that we have deficiencies or gaps. Let's just strengthen those gaps and mitigate what we can or what we need to. Step 3 through 5, I think, are universal, right? And they're industry best practices. Continuously monitor your program. So one of the things that I did not mention at the beginning during my intro was I spent 23 years active duty in the Navy doing cybersecurity as an information security technician. Continuous monitoring is, I think, a global standard now, and it's something that the DoD adopted probably 2 decades ago in its infancy. You are continuously monitoring your environment or your program for vulnerabilities, for threats, and those threats are anything from external threat actors or anomalous alerts detected in your security incident and event management system. And a lot of that is personnel behavior, user behavior, insider threat, or poor cybersecurity hygiene from your administrators and from your users. Oh, hey, we have a group account and we share the password because it's just easier to access everything from a single account. Poor hygiene, right? And that absolutely is susceptible to many different threat vectors, social engineering, or I left my password written down underneath my I don't even remember what we used to call them, the thing you put on your desk with the calendar, the desktop calendar thing with the leather bound edges, right? Like, I don't know how many times we found passwords written down under those. So again, continuous monitoring, step 3. Identifying vulnerabilities, identifying threat vectors, identifying weaknesses in both the system and user behavior. Step 4, leverage recent and relevant insights to continuously update your program. And I think step 3 actually informs quite a bit of this. Continuous monitoring also includes, and I think this is an Artalist internal tenet, right? One of the things that we continuously monitor is the global cyber landscape. What's going on in the world today? What are the new threat vectors? What are the new vulnerabilities? What are the new tools and methodologies used to mitigate any of those particular things? What are the new technologies that we can employ to harden our environment, right? I can't defend an environment that hasn't been hardened, and I can't harden an environment that I don't have awareness of what my risks and vulnerabilities are. So monitoring the industry, monitoring the cyber landscape across the globe on a routine basis is a fairly critical piece of continuing your risk management strategy. And then finally, step 5, strategically invest in cybersecurity resources. I think a lot of people hear that statement and say, oh, well, you're telling me I need to just dump a bunch of money into my infrastructure. Well, no, not necessarily. That strategic investment could also be a particular skill set. It could be a certification that specifically focuses on threat management or threat reduction, how to properly identify trends in your SOC alerts and SOC reports, what your analysts are doing. Or it could be, okay, I need to invest in a new boundary protection device or solution. I need to invest in a more hardened infrastructure, or I need to invest in a service that is providing those types of things for me. So in a nutshell, 1 through 5, I think steps 1 and 2, you have a couple different pathways. One is a industry standard that's been around for a long time, gap analysis, plan, and then adopt that plan and start implementing it. Or step 1 being, let's just start net new and assume that we're breached, or assume that we have more vulnerabilities than are worth patching or remediating. So now let's talk about building your approach to cybersecurity. How do we get compliant, right? Like what are the things that we need to know? What are the areas of consideration to build an effective strategy for CMMC? Step 1, like, what is your long-term goal? What level of CMMC do you want to achieve? Are you looking just for a level 1 to meet your basic SPRS submission, or are you looking for a level 2 program? Or ultimately, do you know that you need to land in a level 3 compliant program? Step 2, okay, now let's talk about near-term goals. Do we want to take multiple steps or implement it all at once? So really, let's employ a very long-term phased approach and decide what that phased approach is going to be. Or are we going to do a big bang net new environment? Because a net new environment with a net new implementation based on safeguarding CUI, is that going to be more cost effective, and is it going to be easier to adopt, right? And I think some of the pieces of that are, what is your business operation willing to accept from a disruption standpoint, right? So user behavior, business operations. Hey, if we do a big bang all at once implementation, is that going to be better for the business? Is that going to be better for the users? Or if we start rolling out pieces and moving people and then moving capabilities and then moving data in phases, is that longer term approach going to actually be more disruptive in the long run? And I think understanding what user behavior is willing to change and what user behavior has to remain the same because of the business operations is a big piece of your near-term goal planning. Step 3, scope. What systems and data do you need to protect? I think we all understand that CUI is at the top of mind when we say what type of data do we need to protect. But is there proprietary data that's not necessarily categorized as CUI, but you also want to treat it like it's CUI because it's internal to the business and it's what sets you aside? Is there partnership or supply chain or supplier information that you want to safeguard because of the sensitivity of it? All things to consider. Step 4, technology. What technology should you adopt? Like, have you considered, okay, well, we currently are operating in a big on-premise environment. We have a data center. We have a lot of third-party tools. We have a lot of physical VM hosts hosting a ton of virtual workstations or virtual interface, desktop interface clients. Is that a technology you want to continue to support, or is there another potentially cloud-based technology that is going to be more cost-effective and more business-friendly, provide more efficacy for the things that you're trying to do? Can you streamline and decommission some of your older on-premise equipment that requires lifecycle management, right? Like what is the cost of ownership long term? Okay, I know I need to replace these physical servers every 3 to 5 years. I need to renew my licensing every 1 to 3 years. I need to continually provide maintenance for the physical equipment and for the building itself, cooling, uninterruptible power, those types of long-term planning solutions. What is my continuity of operations plan, and what's my disaster recovery plan? Does it make sense to continue doing it this way, or do we move into a compliant program with a completely new technology that eliminates the need for a lot of those things? And then step 5, what resources do you need and what do you already have? Are you going to leverage a completely new environment? Do you have the skill sets and personnel? Do you have the certifications and user-based resources? Are all those in place? Do you need to staff new things? Does it make more sense to reach out and get a third-party vendor like an MSP or an MSSP to support in a lot of cases? So those are your five primary building blocks for deciding or building your strategy to achieve CMMC compliance. So I think here, Rich and I are going to spend a little bit of time talking about what your major routes to CMMC are. And kind of in line with that risk mitigation strategy slide, I think we have 2 routes that talk about the different paths. You can see right there, route 1, step 1, consulting, gap analysis, remediation plan, and then do it. Route 2, managed service. Let's migrate you to a compliant program and deliver all of your policies and configurations, right? So there's our 2 routes. And Rich,
is that like more of a on approach and then a hands-off approach there from providers? What would you say that is there, John?
I'm sorry, I only caught half of that. What was the question, Rich?
Would that be a hands-on approach on managed service or a hands-off approach? How does that work? Is it kind of both hands-off on the
well, I think managed services offer a couple different options for you to leverage, right? There are managed service programs where the MSP is providing as much hands-on on behalf of the organization, from policies to the hardening configurations to the defense of the environment, or as little as the organization wants, because they already have an IT staff and they need They need some oversight, and maybe they have the IT staff, but they don't have the SOC staff. So the MSP is providing a basic governing, hardening, and defending type program versus the full on, okay, I'm going to do all of your tier 1 through tier 3 support. I'm going to interact with your users. I'm going to do desktop support for users that have problems with applications. So I think I answered your question. I may have
Yeah, no,
gone a
absolutely.
little over.
Absolutely you did. Thank you, Josh, for that. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like the Route 1 area there, essentially you would have somebody writing you a prescription and you'd have to go fill it. Yeah, tasks and things for you to do. So that's an internal piece. You have to take that on yourself, or maybe go find a managed service to do exactly what they consulted you to figure out
No,
there.
exactly, right. And I think you have different you have different routes based on size of company, scope of what they're trying to achieve, and like for the small business, the small startup business is conducting a gap analysis and providing a remediation plan and handing it to a 1 to 10 person organization that is fully invested in executing the contract, not building the environment. Does that make sense? Is that cost effective? Is that going to provide enough time to build out the environment or fix the current environment versus, hey, I know you only have 1 to 10 employees, and you're all focused on executing contracts. The managed service can come in and do the IT for you, get you compliant, keep you compliant in that continuous monitoring framework philosophy.
So I guess in what looks good in Route 1, essentially is for that provider, like you said, is going to come in willing to step in and review these and discuss all the necessary requirements that are there. They're going to provide you with help and assistance, maybe, and then discuss, how you're going to remain compliant after you gotten started on the plan they've put you off on the pathway.
Right. Like, and I think Route 1 and Route 2 both have their places. It's very organization specific, and I think there's a lot of conversation that happens with each company looking for some degree of support. What makes the most sense for them? And regardless of which route you take, there are things that make those particular things successful, right? Like, and you'll see in the what looks good section under Route 1 with that standard consulting engagement where the gap analysis and remediation plan is done. Is that consulting organization willing to review and discuss all 110 controls out of NIST 171? Do they have a full understanding of what those controls mean and know how or have an idea of what an assessor is going to look for when it comes time for a certification assessment, right? Like, does that consulting organization have templates to assist in remediating gaps in policies and other documentation required, like the cybersecurity program, the SSP? If they do, then yeah, that looks great. Like they're a good consulting organization that knows how to execute those things. Is the provider discussing how you'll remain compliant after completing that remediation plan? Then they probably have the experience and skill set to make sure that you understand what to do. But if they don't have very good answers there, I would question if that's the right organization. Things to look out for when the gap analysis conducted. Is it complete, right? Did they address all 110 controls? And did they address any additional questions that you as the organization had about what you're currently doing and what you should be doing better? Another thing to look out for is a firm that promises you'll get compliant without discussing ongoing responsibilities. So if I come in and say, okay, here's all the things that we're going to do, and we're going to get you compliant today. What about tomorrow after we're all said and done? The engagement's complete. Are you compliant when the engagement's complete? I You might be, but
Maybe.
then how are you now monitoring your log your um you're aggregating logs into a sim. How are you monitoring those logs? How are you responding to alerts? How are you ensuring that that your logging is your logs are still being aggregated? How do I know if audit logging is disabled or fails? Um, so there's a ton of things that happen on day two after the consulting organization implements their program or implements their recommendations and then walks away at the end of the engagement. There's a ton of things that happen on day two and every day thereafter that if the company that was the recipient of that engagement isn't doing or doesn't know that they have to do or doesn't know how to do them, that are now not meeting CMMC requirements, right? Whereas in route two, where you have an MSP, um, you have an organization that can and will, depending on, I guess, what you're buying and what you're paying for, do all of those things for you, right? Like the ability to provide evidence when asked that those things are being done in the periodicity or frequency that they are required to be done in is a big piece of how that organization can prove they're ready to be assessed and certified. Um,
I think
if
you have a
the
good point.
and just like with the consulting, a good MSP is willing to discuss and enable all 110 controls out of 800 one thing that's a little bit different is a a good MSP is going to provide a shared responsibility matrix, which clearly describes what they do versus what the company is doing, right? So if I'm the MSP, Rich, and you are the company, our shared responsibility matrix will say, I am responsible for these particular controls. I am supporting you as the responsible party in these particular controls, right? Like as an MSP, especially in the remote world that we live in, I'm not going to tell you that, hey, I'm going to be on site with you. I'm not, more often than not. So your facilities security officer is going to be responsible for this number of controls because it's physical. It's in person on premise requirements. But I will support you with the policies and the updates.
That is great. And they'll do that essentially for the certification as well as afterwards that you identified day two, you still need to be certified. And those
Exactly.
responsibilities flow and follow just the same. I was responsible for them before the assessment. I will be responsible for them after the assessment.
Right. And I know we're right up against time. One of the other things I wanted to call out for, like one of the things to look out for with MSPs, providers that force you 100% on their system and processes without taking your business or mission into account. Being able to move into a compliant managed service program and still having control over the environment being yours versus mine, I think is a big piece of the puzzle, right? So, what happens if you decide to part ways with the MSP halfway through the contract? Well, now you have to start over because the MSP owns the environment versus you owning the environment and the MSP managing it.
Live show you guys visual of what the next steps look like here with Artemis. So with us, essentially, we would start by getting your business risk assessment done. Our program consultants can help you analyze your business risk, help you benchmark, yourself against, your gaps and opportunities, be able to get you ready to understand where to go next, as we identified. We'll check out your NIS 800-171 self-assessment tool. Go online. These are tools essentially that would help you move along and get closer to the CMMC certification pathway that's there. Visit us and our resources Go to our library for more content. There's a lot of great content out there for you to get some familiarity and uncertainty and now be able to get some understanding from us, essentially. Come with us. You can help move along with our product Tesseract, essentially give you a free program design.